Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. We are here today to discuss the pressing economic concerns that confront Spain and the Eurozone as a whole. We will be placing a special emphasis on the issue of high unemployment in Spain for today's policy meeting. To my left is Mr. Luis de Guindos, Spanish Minister of Finance. To my right is Ms. Christine Lagarde, head of the International Monetary Fund. And to my far right is Mr. Albert Rivera, head of the Ciudadanos political party. My name is Mario Draghi, chairman of the European Central Bank. And before we begin, Ms. Lagarde, why don't you start us off by giving us a general overview of the EU economy in regards to GDP growth, unemployment, and inflation.
Thank you, Mr. Draghi. Currently, the European Union has been stagnating in years of slow growth since the end of a double-dip recession. As you can see from Figure 1, growth throughout all of 2014 was less than a disappointing 0.5%. This is worrying, as it could be seen as a new long-term growth trend.
However, Ms. Lagarde, the recovery has begun to accelerate thanks to the decline in oil prices as well as the depreciation of the euro, which has greatly benefited export-based industries.
While slow growth is a prominent concern, price stability is a major concern as well. Historically, European nations have been faced with disastrous times of inflation, such as Germany's post-World War hyperinflation. In more recent times, however, disinflation has gripped the EU, and we now see outright deflation as shown by Figure 2. This trend has already begun to accelerate from a negative 0.2% to a negative 0.6%. Nations such as Spain, however, see deflation at over twice as severe at negative 1.3%. This represents an emerging deflationary spiral which will put a burden on borrowers, further tighten credit, and disincentivize foreign investment, causing aggregate demand to fall further.
While the negative effects of deflation are worrying, the underutilization of labor is a much more prominent concern regarding slow growth. Compared to the 5.5% unemployment rate in the United States, one of the largest worldwide economies, periphery countries in the Eurozone have unemployment rates as high as 20%. As you can see from Figure 3, all the countries in orange have youth unemployment rates over 20%, with some as high as 50%. Neither Spain nor the Eurozone will be able to realize any of their long-term growth prospects if youth and structural unemployment are so high.
I believe that one of the major causes of this slow growth in Europe is the crushing fiscal debt that many countries have undertaken. Currently, the average debt to GDP ratio for the euro area is 90.9%, which is far above the threshold of 60% intended by the Maastricht Treaty. Large debt crowds out private investment by raising long-term interest rates for investors.
I disagree. Although debt can crowd out investment, the ECB has dropped interest rates to record lows. However, demand has not yet risen, thus showing that investment demand is generally inelastic. The real culprits of slow growth are the massive trade imbalances seen within Europe, as shown in Figure 4. Before the euro was implemented, periphery countries such as Greece and Spain had robust export economies, thanks to their lower exchange rates and cheaper labor costs. However, after the euro was implemented, those same countries lost that competitive advantage. Central European nations, however, have used the euro to build record-level current account surpluses, which are the main reason, I believe, for the discrepancies in growth. The IMF has stated that Germany can implement policy that will boost consumption and reverse their massive trade surpluses, therefore decreasing recovery times.
I'd like to move our attention into some recent steps taken to alleviate the crisis. On numerous occasions, I have said that we at the ECB are willing to do whatever it takes within our mandate to preserve the euro. I'm pleased to announce that we have taken the right steps to try and accelerate growth. The ECB has started a stimulus program where it will buy $1.1 trillion of asset-backed securities and government bonds from various nations within the EU in order to inject liquidity. With this added liquidity, nations can stimulate their economies through spending on infrastructure and other much-needed projects. Already, we have seen positive results as improved investor expectations have helped to drive down bond yields in many struggling nations. For example, in Spain, the 3-month bond yield recently sold at negative yield rates. This policy is very similar to the rounds of quantitative easing, which had great success in the United States and the United Kingdom.
Although this program is admirable in motive, I see several critical drawbacks. First off, Mr. Draghi, quantitative easing is artificially suppressing the bond yields of many nations. For example, given Spain's poor financials, a 10-year yield rate of 1.4% does not correspond to the risks present. I fear that the governments of these nations will take advantage of the cheap credit now and spend frivolously, thus resulting in a moral hazard. When interest rates increase again, these nations will be unable to pay back their debt. This is exactly what led to the current debt crisis in the United States and Europe. It is also important to realize that these nations have had access to extremely cheap credit, practically free money for many years, as you can see from Figure 5. Yet this cheap credit has been ineffective at fueling any sort of real economic expansion. I fear that this increased liquidity will actually have a counter effect by encouraging a liquidity trap to emerge and actually tighten credit. In addition, I do not believe that this asset purchase program is that similar to the rounds of quantitative easing that were successful in the United States and Europe. As you can see from figure 6, the size of the monetary stimulus is much smaller as a percentage of potential government shares.
Mr. Draghi, we must also recognize the drastic socio-political consequences that disparate growth in the European Union has caused. We have seen an unprecedented rise in nationalism in the European Union. For instance, in recent months, Syriza, a radical left-wing Greek party, scored a major victory in Greek elections, nearly 40% of a vote. Syriza has run on a platform of anti-austerity and has threatened to leave the EU. This is the first time in over 70 years that a radical party has scored the majority in Greek elections. Other such nationalistic parties, such as the German National Democratic Party, the French National Front, and the UK Independence Party, have also been gaining popularity. The promise of joining the EU was peace and prosperity. Without the latter, the bonds holding the EU together will weaken.
Thank you for your general assessment of the economic situation in the EU. I agree with Mr. Guintos that perhaps our most pressing concern is the issue of high unemployment. I'd like to move our attention to the economic situation in Spain, a nation which I feel most reflects stubbornly high unemployment. Currently, Spain has one of the highest unemployment rates in the entire EU, at 23.7%, which has only slightly gone down since the last recession in 2013. Moreover, Spain has the highest youth unemployment rate in the entire EU at 51.7%. Youth unemployment is so severe that the current young workers are known as the lost generation. Without the skills and job experience needed, these young workers will not be able to fill the gap of skilled labor needed by the complex global economy. I'd like to get your opinions on the depth of this crisis.
I believe that one major contributor to the high youth unemployment in Spain is the recent housing bubble. When the bubble burst, many young workers who were involved in the inflated construction of the housing industry found themselves to be structurally unemployed, as they simply did not have the skills nor the training necessary in order to transition into other industries. Also, the negative effects of the housing crash still persist, as according to The Guardian, 3.4 million out of the 11 million unsold houses in Europe are located in Spain.
I believe that private sector debt most contributes to Spain's unemployment woes. Currently, Spain is growing at a rate of 2%, which is faster than most other EU countries. While this is by no means robust, one would subsequently expect unemployment to go down. However, businesses are so burdened with debt that they are reluctant to hire new workers until they are assured that the economic revival is here to last. According to the Wall Street Journal, private sector debt is almost 220% of Spain's GDP. We see a similar problem with federal debt, which is around 96.85% of GDP. The Spanish government simply cannot engage in stimulus until we address this problem. As such, I believe that austerity must be utilized in order to deleverage the economy and prepare it for future growth.
Ms. Lagarde, I respectfully disagree. Spain has already gone through several rounds of draconian austerity cuts, and we have been successful in deleveraging our massive debt. Extra austerity cuts run the risk of causing another recession, which would only further increase debts through added automatic stabilizers such as unemployment benefits. We must also take into account that in a growing economy, private sector debt is not necessarily negative. It can signify that businesses are willing to take risks and are predicting future growth. The root of the problem, however, is the Spanish education system. It's simply not producing enough skilled workers to meet the demands of businesses. At 23.8%, the high school dropout rate in Spain is the highest in all of the Eurozone. Furthermore, a quarter of our 15 to 29-year-olds are not in any kind of formal job, education, or training program.
Mr. Guintos, creating a large supply of skilled labor will make them more employable, but we will not see real job creation until businesses move and expand in Spain. We should aim at making the business environment more conducive and competitive. Currently, Spain ranks 33rd in the world in terms of ease of doing business and 35th in terms of global competitiveness, below most OECD nations. High corporate tax rates at 30% and stringent labor laws place it at a rank of 74th in terms of starting a business. These Byzantine regulations have caused a massive exodus of over 130,000 people who have drawn out nearly 75 billion euros, equivalent to 7% of GDP, out of the nation.
Mr. Draghi, you mentioned the strict Spanish labor laws, which, combined with a lack of market flexibility, contribute to slow growth and high unemployment. Workers can only work for 40 hours per week maximum, up to 9 hours a day. In addition, firing unproductive workers is also very costly. Currently, workers receive 20 days of wages per year worked and up to 12 months of wages. These unemployment benefits are very generous, at 70% of previous income, compared to around 40 to 50% in the United States. These lavish benefits and strict labor laws lead to low productivity.
Ms. Lagarde, I'd like to further address what you said about low productivity in Spain, which, as you can see from Figure 7, has been stagnating for the past 5 years. I believe that we can solve this problem by revamping Spain's research and development programs, which, as you can see from Figure 8, are simply insufficient at only 1.3% of GDP, less than half the ratio of what most European nations currently spend. I believe that we can fund these programs by cutting 1/3 of the budget from the construction of high-speed railways and reinvesting the saved money into these programs. In addition, I believe that one major reason Spain lags behind in R&D spending is due to the appalling lack of big businesses. As you can see from Figure 9, less than 0.8% of Spanish companies hire more than 50 workers. In addition, according to The Economist, the average Spanish firm only hires 4.7 workers. Bigger businesses invest more in R&D spending and are more resilient to cyclical contractions. While mid-sized businesses do have the highest effective tax rates, they are more heavily regulated once they reach 6 million euros in revenue, a step that often disincentivizes business growth.
Now that we have analyzed the reasons for high unemployment, I'd like to move into some potential solutions to fix the problem. Personally, I feel that one of the biggest problems is the astounding number of NEETs, that is, youth who are not in employment, education, or training. It is imperative to give these young workers the opportunity to upgrade their skill set so that they can lead the economy of tomorrow.
Mr. Draghi, I completely agree. And one way to upgrade the skills of our young workers is to emulate Germany's apprenticeship programs, which allow students to gain applicable skills while still completing school. Students are more incentivized to stay in school, and businesses would be able to handpick from a wide pool of promising young workers. Combined with this vocational training program, the rigor and curriculum of Spain's education system must be improved as well, with a shift from philosophy and theory to more practical skills like engineering. These set of reforms would be in correlation with the strategy for entrepreneurship and youth employment, the most recent set of reforms we are trying to take.
Cutting of stringent labor laws will help to liberate the market and allow prices and wages to adjust in accordance to Say's law. This will encourage businesses to grow and finally hire more workers. I believe that the work limit should be gradually increased from 40 to 48 hours per week. In addition, the massive cost associated with firing a worker should be gradually decreased so that businesses are able to streamline themselves and get rid of any unproductive workers. This will not only aid in increasing productivity, but will help to deleverage corporate debt, which, as you said, Ms. Lagarde, will help position companies for future growth.
There's one very important barrier to growth that I believe we have yet to consider. In most EU nations, there is the value-added tax, or VAT, which serves as a sort of sales tax with rates depending on the type of good purchased. Spain has an average VAT rate of 21%. I believe that the Spanish government should declare a temporary tax holiday for the rest of this year and lower it to a more attractive level, say 10 to 15%. Moreover, decreasing the housing VAT, which is currently at 10%, will spur consumption in housing, which, as you know, is a multiplier industry. Appreciating housing prices will also create a positive wealth effect for the Spanish economy. The resulting increase in consumption will help to reverse the onsetting deflationary spiral, accelerate growth, and stimulate real job creation.
Mr. Draghi, an additional policy the government might take is to partially subsidize businesses and encourage them to hire, even if it's only temporarily or part-time. This would help increase employment and alleviate wage scars as well as structural unemployment.
These policies will be difficult to finance. However, by increasing employment, the Spanish government reduces the money needed for transfer payments and actually increases revenue from income taxes. Thus, I believe that these policies will be deficit neutral. In addition, as we believe that Spain is to the right of a peak in the Laffer curve, we believe that cutting corporate tax rates will actually increase revenue by fostering business growth.
Well, Ms. Lagarde, one policy that the government can take is to pass the TTIP, or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the United States and Europe. By cutting trade regulations and tariffs, Spain's long-term GDP per capita is estimated to grow by 6.5%.
Thank you for your time. I believe we have had a spirited discussion and made a solid plan for pro-growth reforms. Thank you. Everyone enjoy some time there.
Yeah, did you hold it?
Thank you. I'll ask you two general questions first, and then we'll turn to the more specific questions, okay? 9 countries in the European Union are not in the euro area. Are these countries likely to take the necessary steps to adopt the euro as their currency? Why or why not?
Well, what we have to understand is that the original countries that joined the euro did so under the promises of peace and prosperity, under the free trade agreements. Now, what we've seen is that there has been a maintenance of peace, but the prosperity has not been so much guaranteed. Many of these countries simply have no reason to join the EU at this time, given the current financial woes. Unemployment being so high the way it is, future nations are unlikely to join the EU unless structural reform is created. One of the biggest things about the EU is that although it's a monetary union, it fails to fiscally unite the nations. This means that some nations can more prudently invest in fiscally responsible pro-growth reforms. And until a fiscal compact is such agreed, it'll be harder to truly save the euro and preserve it so that long-term growth can be ensured.
Thank you. The second question is, the euro has recently declined against the dollar. It went from 138 a year ago and is now at 112. What effects might this change have on the euro area's economy?
Well, it's actually a very good thing for export-based industries such as Greece and Spain, who are currently failing. The retail sales for Spain specifically have gone up to 3.6% this month. And although that can show that imports have also gone up, because the narrowing of the trade deficits has occurred to negative 2 billion, we can also assume that exports have gone up as well, showing that the depreciation of the euro has positively impacted these nations.
What's important to understand is that before the euro was implemented, periphery nations like Spain and Greece had the advantage that they could simply devalue their currency in order to attain cheap and competitive exports. However, with the instigation of the euro, they have no such cost-price advantage, and often the core countries such as Germany and Austria have been completely outcompeting them because of their higher productivity. This lower euro greatly benefits periphery countries, especially Spain, Greece, and Portugal, as much of their economy is derived from tourist-like activities, which benefit from a lower valued currency.
A lot of your focus here is on how getting youth unemployment up is kind of a major goal of fixing Spain's economy. One of the things, the other flip side of that, however, is not just that Spain doesn't have skilled workers because it's not training them, it's because skilled workers are leaving Spain in great numbers because there's not enough job mobility in the country. And so they're essentially reaping the benefits of being in the EU and moving to other EU countries. How would you keep those skilled workers rather than creating new ones?
So the reason that these skilled workers are leaving is simply because of lack of job opportunity and financial stability. Now, in order to truly create more jobs, we need to incentivize business growth. The reforms we outlined in this speech will not only subsidize business startups and cut taxes and incentivize business growth, but it'll also help larger corporations that are already firmly established. The problem is that large corporations in Spain simply are too few in number, and larger corporations are more likely to research and R&D, thus increase productivity, and they also are less resilient, they're more resilient to cyclical contractions, making them a more stable force of employment.
Okay. Part of what you were talking about is changing taxes, VAT, corporate tax rates. Given the constraints that you have within the monetary union, I guess the question is, how realistic do you think it is that Spain can actually lower tax rates, particularly below where their neighbors are? And in addition, if you think about, Spain's position or President Draghi, your position as the European Central Bank president, do you think it's appropriate for countries to use competitive movements in their tax rates as a way of improving performance?
Well, as stated previously, we believe that using these corporate tax rates will increase business growth and business revenue and productivity, because we believe that Spain is to the right of the Laffer curve.
So to go on that, what we believe is that Spain's tax elasticity is actually greater than 1. Therefore, that by cutting these taxes will foster enough extra business growth to actually increase in revenues. Now, in terms of using competitive taxes to stimulate growth, this is simply all we can do, as Spain must find a way to incentivize business growth. Spain simply does not have enough large businesses or even mid-sized businesses and must do something to make it competitive against other EU nations. What other nations have in infrastructure and financial stability, Spain needs to make up in a more conducive business environment.
A more general question. You spent some time explaining the rise of radical parties in Europe. And you said that, peace and prosperity used to be the glue holding European countries together. What would you suggest could reinforce the glue at this point in time?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
What would be the reforms or the initiatives to take to reinforce the glue between European countries so that the ties are reinforced?
Well, I believe that the recent policy that Mr. Draghi mentioned, quantitative easing, will help keep these European countries together by improving the economic situation in the EU and thus improving the confidence that countries have in the European Union. For example, Greece is currently not allowed to participate in this quantitative easing, and Greece has also been talking of leaving the EU. If they see that the lower bond yields from quantitative easing is helping countries such as Spain, they may be encouraged to negotiate with the EU and stay with the EU in order to reap these economic benefits.
Well, according to George Soros, famed investor George Soros, Eurobonds might be a possible vehicle for this. Eurobonds are, instead of buying individual, like Spain or Greece, individual debt, you would be buying Euro debt as a whole, which would be seen as before the convergence. So, after the convergence, excuse me. By buying European debt as a whole, instead of just normal countries, the yield rates would go down, and as such, countries like Greece and Spain with their huge amounts of debt would be more willing to participate in the euro.
Just one more question about the labor market. You talked about labor market reform and labor laws, reforming labor laws. Could you give us a hint as to whether these reforms would pay off rapidly, and how you would see that happening in Spain?
Well, our labor reforms are essentially mostly geared towards cutting extraneous benefits. And so businesses are more incentivized to hire. They have more of a financial capacity to hire more workers. And yes, this is true that it's cutting the safety net of many workers. But by doing so, it's increasing the labor force participation rate. And thus, it'll actually increase tax revenues. People are more incentivized because they have to get a job, because they can no longer rely on government benefits. Businesses will be more able to hire them, and in general, real wealth would be created. Although in the short term, yes, there would be some downsides, as a lack of transfer payments would be a deflationary move. And in the long run, this will only incentivize business growth and economic activity.
Business growth is important, as according to Forbes' recent list of top 1,000 companies, 70% of these companies were not on the list 10 years ago. So with the increase in business growth, this will have a long-term effect on the economy as a whole.
In respect to the previous point, how long it would take, currently Prime Minister Rajoy has been losing, Prime Minister Rajoy and the People's Party have been losing popularity because of other groups like the socialist group Podemos, who want to repeal every anti-labor union law that Prime Minister Rajoy's administration has made. So in respect to how long it would take, it is a possibility that it would take far longer than it should, because voters are not willing to vote against their own pensions or their own social security benefits.
Thank you very much. Time is up.
All right.